If you would, turn your Bibles to the book of James. And we have been in James here for a while. We are approaching the final chapter of James. Of course, it's not a real long book. And in some ways, it's not real in depth until you start applying it. And then it's got layers upon layers upon layers and years upon years of work. So the last 2 weeks, we spent the majority of our time outlining 1 through 10. And I just have one question for you on that before we move on. Of course, the premise of 1 through 10 is that there is conflict. And the imagery is layered. There's conflict within us, within me, and there's conflict within the church. And the answer to that, he gives the reasons for it as our own passions, our own desires being put above everything else. The answer is relatively simple. Again, in concept, not so much in practice. The answer was in verse 10. Humble yourselves before the Lord and he will lift you up. And so humbling ourselves is the answer to the problems within and with our relationships with one another. So here's the last question I have on this. Verse 3 says, "You ask and you do not receive because you ask wrongly to spend it on your passions." We're going to be looking at the triumphant entry in the lesson today. And the premise that I want to draw out throughout this week and next week in the lessons is that Jesus did not act like any earthly king would have been expected to act. And the outcome of that is that the outcome of my life, my value and my worth doesn't have to be what this world says or what this world would expect. I don't have to be defined by my failures. I don't have to be defined by my own shortcomings. I can be something much different than that. So here's my question along those lines. Why did Peter walk on the water? There is a connection here between verse 3, what I've just said, and Peter. Why did Peter walk on the water?
Jesus told him to come out.
To go to Jesus, right? To go to Jesus. And that easily overlooked point, I think, is so important to the overall concept of humbling ourselves. And verse 3 about James is saying you ask and you still don't have because you ask for the wrong reasons. Peter didn't walk on the water and say, "Hey, look at me." In fact, he's been humiliated for walking on water, not so much walking on water, but we tend to focus in. Very few talk about Peter walking on water, although he did. Most sermons are about him sinking, right? But Peter didn't walk on water to prove how great he was. He walked on water to get to Christ, both in our individual lives and in our congregate or collective life as a congregation. That's an important aspect of what our motivation is, what we're trying to accomplish. And to do that, we have to humble ourselves. Yep. When he was no longer moving towards Christ, right? Absolutely. Questions or comments before we... Would someone read verses 11 through 12? 11 and 12, please, of James, the 4th chapter.
not evil of one another, brother. He that speaketh evil of his brother, and judgeth his brother, speaketh evil of the law. And judgest the law. But if thou judge the law, thou art not doer of the law, but a judge. There is one lawgiver, who is able to save and destroy. Who art thou that judgest another?
Thank you, Mike.
So, how does this fit in to our overall topic of humbling ourselves? Or you might say the overall topic there in chapter 4 is arrogance, right? How does judging our brother fit into arrogance? You have to judge him, right? You have to think you're better than he is to judge him. What's the problem with that? When we do that, here's what my real question is. When we judge one another, how far have we elevated ourselves? This is James' point.
The position of the judge,
Which is who?
which is Jesus.
Jesus. God. Right?
We don't always think of it that way, but boy, you talk about the height of arrogance. Right there it is. I think that we ought to be very careful with our judgments. For one, oftentimes in the church, we hold judgment as a virtue, right? Well, I've got to know who's in and who's out. I'm not so sure you do. I'm certain I don't know. And what's my position? To teach truth, to keep striving to teach truth, and to do, right? Go ahead.
You can also be a judge of yourself if you feel somebody's doing more than you are and it makes you feel not as capable or whatever.
Yeah.
You judge both ways. You don't just judge because you feel better than somebody else.
Okay. So, that could be,
I'm not sure which way you meant that, is a negative or a positive when we judge ourselves. Okay.
gotcha.
So the part you disagree with what I said is
It's judge because you feel that you feel better, more adequate than other people.
Okay, very valid point. Absolutely.
I think this is how I would view that. I think there's still an element of arrogance there, although it seems very counterintuitive. How many people have judged themselves not worthy? A lot. And that's kind of what I won't measure up to what this other person is. And that seems the opposite of arrogance, doesn't it? But aren't we still elevating ourselves to the position of judge?
What Ernie was saying too, because a lot of times people, when you talk to them, they judge themselves and they don't think they're worthy of going to heaven, you know.
Yes.
And some of them come right out and tell you that.
Well,
And
a lot, right?
So you have to convince them that God will forgive them of anything they've done, you know.
Yeah.
If they obey God's will and do what Christ wants them to do for the rest of their lives. Then they can, have to be judging themselves to be unworthy of that.
Gotcha.
A couple of things on this I think so great for our conversation. And you spoke of terms of them, Bob, and I'm going to ask you a personal question. You don't have to answer if you don't want to. Have you or do you ever feel that way, that you're not good enough?
Oh yeah, I still do.
Yeah.
I suspected that to be the case. It's not other people feel that way alone. Other people do, but I feel that way. You, right. So there's a little bit more to dig into here because you brought some great things out. My point is this, and I'm glad you brought up that flip side. I think there's an element of judgment for ourselves. We're supposed to be judging ourselves in this way. Could I do better? Right? And maybe someone else's particular circumstance says, hey, I could do better. That's not bad judgment where I say, hey, man, I need to change this in my life. Really, I think what you were talking about, and I wasn't sure which way you were, is saying, hey, I won't measure up, right? We're still putting ourselves in the place of the judge, right? That's what Romans, the 4th chapter, is talking about with Abraham. That he didn't let doubt or disbelief get in his road, counting himself as dead. So if Abraham says, listen, because the promise was he's going to have a kid, right? And if Abraham says, I'm not able to do it, isn't he still putting himself in an elevated position of the judge? Of Jesus. Of God. Now, maybe arrogance just isn't big enough of a word to encompass that. But it's still not our position to do that. Now, Bob, and I think this is a matter of semantics or the phrasing. But I think this becomes part of what we struggle with. You can still be forgiven, and I think Bob and I completely disagree. I want to analyze the wording a little bit. As long as you do what Jesus wants going forward. I agree with that in spirit, but I think it says something, or people hear something different than what we're actually saying when we say that. The problem is I didn't measure up, right? And if I'm not capable of it now, I'm not capable of it in the future. Mike, I saw your anniversary is the 29th. Did you know that?
I kind of thought that was coming up, yeah.
Okay, don't forget it. Don't forget, I just did you a tremendous favor. If you're not good enough for Deb now, are you going to get good enough for her?
Not now.
Not now. How many years will it be?
110. Oh,
Thank you.
pushing 40 anyway.
Pushing 40. Wow. And you see, sometimes that becomes our judgment. Listen, in 40 years I've not been good enough. I am not good enough because I'm not going to be good enough next. Here's the message of the cross, and we'll touch on this in the lesson today. And I understand what we have to do is give our heart to Christ and dedicate it to Him. But our actual actions, that's why Jesus gave grace. Is in 40 years, sorry Mike, I haven't measured up. I could take, that's about how long I've been alive, a little bit longer. And so I could take that for my personal life too. In 42 years, soon be 43 years, I've not been good enough. I'm not going to be good enough next year either. And so my judgment very well can be, and righteously should be, I'm not good enough. Jesus says otherwise. Right? That's grace. That's what this sacrifice was about.
God's grace is going to get us through. Because that verse there in 4:17 has always bothered me.
Yeah.
You know, it's always bothered me.
You can't live up to the way we frame that, can you?
Right.
Yeah. You'll never do enough, and Bob's talking about to whosoever knows do good and doeth it not to him is sin.
You'll never, and one of the interesting things, we're going to see it's in a paragraph that puts it in a very different light than how we use it. But we'll never do enough. To put ourselves, to recognize that is reality. To admit defeat and to think that God's grace isn't able to cover me, because that's actually earning, I think, the judgment that we're getting at when we're getting where you're at. Whether we're talking about our brother or myself, God's grace, God's power isn't enough to save them. It's not about me. It's not about my brother. It's about God. Right? There's only one lawgiver and judge. He's able to save and to destroy. The emphasis is on God. Right? It's not my place to judge you, to judge anyone else. It's my place to strive to do. Questions on that? I have one more element of that to bring out before we move on. Comments either. Something that is in this, I can see actions, right? And I can know whether actions are helpful. Broadly speaking, this isn't universally true. I can tell whether actions are helpful or harmful as compared to a certain criteria, right? And I really need to know that information for myself and for my brother, for my fellow mankind. Here's where I think we cross this line, and we do it with other people more than ourselves. Assigning motivation. Assigning motivation. So, when Bob came in, he may have locked this door behind him, right? Now, is that helpful for us this morning? If he locked this door behind Lauren? No, it's obviously not helpful, right? We have other people that are going to be. I should use this one over here because that's more likely that someone to walk through it here in a few minutes. Is that helpful? No, it's not helpful. In fact, there's a good chance that a couple people are going to be coming in this door in just a little bit, right? Now, Bob, that I can figure out. That I can judge we'll use. That's not helpful. We'll probably unlock the door. Bob did that just for spite. There is where I've crossed the line, isn't it? Maybe Bob had information that we didn't have. Maybe it was helpful. Eh? 2, maybe his mind was just somewhere else. Maybe Bob's in the habit of helping close down after services and just was distracted with everything going on and just was a mistake. Maybe Bob just had different, say, criteria that he was looking at. Right? Here's something I think is helpful for all of us. When we think about people's actions and phrases and interactions, reactions to situations, very little of it is about you. Let me rephrase that. When you go to the cashier at Giant Eagle and that lady's snappy with you, it's probably not because she hates you. It's probably because she has something else going on in her life, either that day or in her past. It's not about you. You know, how often do we get offended about things that have nothing to do for us? These people cut you off on the road or pull out in front of you and then make a left-hand turn 200 feet. They weren't thinking about you at all. But Boy, it sure does feel like they had me in their sights, right? And that's why judgment is in ours, right? And that's helpful for me anyhow, to remember it's not about me. Not everything's about me, right? We're getting back to that humility again. Questions or comments? Okay, would someone read 13 through 17, please?
Go to now, ye that say, today or tomorrow ye will go into such a city and continue there a year, and buy and sell and get gain. Whereas ye know not what shall be on the morrow, for what is your life? It is even a vapor that appeareth for a little time, and then vanishes away. For what ye ought to say, if the Lord will, ye shall live, and do this or that. But now ye rejoice in your boasting. All such rejoicing is evil. Therefore to him that knoweth to do good, and doeth it not, to him it is sin.
Okay, thank you, Bob. And we're going to categorize 13 through 17 as the arrogance of wealth, and chapter 5, 1 through 6 is the danger of wealth. The arrogance of wealth and the danger of wealth. As we look about the arrogance of wealth, James is saying, hey, you're saying you're going to go do this, and you're going to do this, and you're going to do that. What you ought to be saying is, or let me ask a question. What is being left out of the equation? Yeah. God, right? We could phrase that a number of different ways. God. Remember, what chapter is that in Luke? Is it Luke 10 or 11? 12. I just need to keep counting. The parable of the rich fool, where he says, I am going to build bigger barns, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. What do you leave out of the equation? What was most important? God, right? And it's God that says, you fool. Why is he a fool? He didn't take God into the equation. The same principle is here in this chapter. Is it wrong to have plans? No, that's not what it's talking about. He's saying God is to be the central part of your plans. On Sunday nights, we just finished a series on honing our congregation's vision, right? We have things we're working towards, we want to accomplish. When we lose sight of the fact that everything we're accomplishing is to be for God, by God, and of God, we're off base, right? We're back to Peter. Why did Peter step out of the boat? Right? I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. I'm going to do this. If the Lord wills, this is what I intend to accomplish. Right? He's the central piece of that puzzle. Questions or comments? So Bob, verse 17, I've always isolated out of, in my mind, just all by itself. You know, and we quote that verse, it's my Bible highlighted. You know, what's that mean? It's one of those verses you can go to use for a purpose, right? And it's an unattainable purpose. To anyone that knows do good and doeth it not, to him is sin. How many of you have known something good this morning you could have done and you didn't do it? Mike, did you make a beautiful breakfast for Brenda this morning? No. Would that be a good thing to do?
Maybe.
Brenda, would that be a good thing for Mike to do?
Yeah, he could start.
Yeah!
Anytime.
She didn't even hesitate. Yeah, that'd be wonderful. That'd be a good. Mike knows that it would be good, even though he doesn't want to admit it to it, and he didn't do it. Right? That's an unattainable standard to live up to. Bear in mind, and Bob, read again the first word, the King James, verse 7. Is it therefore?
17 there.
Yeah, 17.
Therefore to him that knoweth to do good.
Therefore. Yep. Therefore to him who knoweth to do good. The ESV read, so whoever knows. Do you see the connection? This verse is not an isolated thought. It's easy for us to make it that way because we've got a verse. It's number 17 for it. But it's connected to this. Now, I just went to Luke, the 12th chapter, a few moments ago. Go in your minds back to Luke, the 10th chapter, to the parable of the Good Samaritan. You could give me lots of reasons, so don't answer this question. But the priest is coming down and he sees the guy in the ditch. Why doesn't he stop and help him? And then the Levite's coming down. He sees the man in the ditch. Why doesn't he stop to help him? I think the most overarching answer to that is they both had plans. They had things to do. Malcolm Gladwell, in his book Tipping Point, and I've used this several times, but to me it's mind-blowing, mentions a sociology study that was done in a seminary. You've heard me tell this story, most of you, before. They took 10 seminary students and said, listen, I want you to prepare a lesson on Luke 10, the Good Samaritan, and go here and preach it. And then along the way, they have someone in the ditch that has been beat and in need of immediate help. How many of them stopped and helped? If you don't know, take a guess. All 10. All 10. Right? They got the point, or so it would seem. Now, they redid the exact same experiment. Prepare a lesson on Luke 10, the Good Samaritan. You're going to preach it this time. And then at the last minute, someone comes in and said, I'm sorry, I got the time wrong. You're already late. Get over there right away. Now, Stephanie, you're a whole lot closer to the truth. And it wasn't quite none, but it was one or two. It was low minority that stopped to help them. Why? They had plans. Here's a real question, hard-hitting question for my life. How many times do my plans interfere with what God needs for my life? Bob, I think that's the real meaning of verse 17. Don't let my plans, what I've had in my head to get done, interfere with what should be done in this moment. Questions or comments? Go ahead.
How much has to do with not knowing the right thing to do and failing to do it?
How much has to do, how much
Or
is
is
what?
it, I know, could that be part of the equation?
Yeah, I think that's why it's stated, so whosoever knows to do good.
You know, we're not talking about shortcomings of ignorance, right?
But they were likely passing corpses and things on the road as well. It's a different time. And for us to give judgment, I think, is hard without compassion.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think that's exactly, though, which Jesus' point was.
He was judging those two, that they should have known, and they had other priorities. Yes. In compassion, and this is probably why you used that word, compassion is the word that Jesus ascribes to the Samaritan.
He had compassion. That's what they were lacking, right? And that's what
our plans oftentimes take aside.
Are we on the same page? Or?
Yeah.
All right. would someone read 1 through 6 of chapter 5, the dangers of wealth?
Therefore, come now, you rich, weep and howl for your miseries that are coming upon you. Your riches are corrupted, and your garments are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver are corroded, and their corrosions will be a witness against you, and will eat your flesh like fire. You have heaped up treasures in the last days. Indeed, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, cry out, and the cries of the reapers have reached the ears of the Lord of Sabbath. You have lived on the earth in pleasure and in luxury. You have fattened your hearts as in the days of slaughter. You have condemned, you have murdered the just. He does not resist you. Therefore be patient, brethren, until the coming of the Lord. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth, waiting patiently for it until it receives the early and the latter rain.
Thank you. Notice 13 of chapter 4 and verse 1 of chapter 5 start with the same terminology. Come on now, or come now. Pay attention. Both of these, I don't believe James is talking so much to the people saying you're doing this. He's saying be aware of this and don't do it. And then ultimately where he's going to start in verse 7 is to say be patient. Endure the shortcomings. God is not oblivious to what you're going through at the hands of these individuals. Also, though, the idea of arrogance plays through these, each one of these. And the verse eludes me, and I'm thinking it was Peter or John that mentions about having snared themselves through because they desire to be rich. Someone Googles or looks that verse up. Many have ensnared themselves through, pierced themselves through with desire to be rich. When you take that idea to what this verse is talking, or what this passage is talking about, I think you're seeing very well how our plans impact what we do. Is our motivation, is our plan, is our arching goal that dictates what we do to become wealthy? Go ahead. Thank you for I should have said either Peter or John. 1 Timothy 6:9. Are you there? Go ahead and read if you would.
Those who desire to be rich fall into temptation and a snare, and into many foolish and harmful lusts which drown men in destruction and perdition.
Thank you.
Or destruction.
Thank you. So the idea is here, our goals, our plans, just like we looked in the previous passage. What's our goals? Now, notice this. What the riches do. Oh, I'm still in Peter. I'm like, that does not read. Or I mean, I was in 1 Timothy. I'm almost there. All right. Your riches, verse 2, have rotted, and your garments are moth-eating. Your gold and silver have corroded, and their corrosion will be evidence against you and will eat your flesh like fire. Okay. Wow. Paints a scary picture to begin with. But take close note of what's being said. Your garments that get moth eaten. Are those garments that you've been wearing a lot? No, they're the garments in the closet. The precious metals that become corroded. Is that money that you've been using for anything? Now, it's money's been stored up, right? This is the point. You've desired to be rich, and you have so much abundance that you're not even using it. And you could have done good with it. You could have helped. And so it's going to be your own wealth. You thought it was an asset, but it's going to be a witness against you in the court of law. What's the overriding idea? Bob, it's that verse 17. Do good. Do good. What you have. Don't allow your plans to get in the road of what God would have us to do. And so that last verse is, the oppression of the Christian. And he says, to the next part we'll get into next week, says to the Christian, I see what's going on. This isn't going to last forever. Stay strong. Thank you for your time.